What was the situation in Bengal in 1942?
In Bengal in 1942, you already had a very difficult situation, and that's interesting because there was a bumper crop that year. The problem was that there had been a lot of shortages already showing up. Reason being was that India was a major part of the war effort. So a lot of things were being taken out of India at the time, like wheat from the west, even railway tracks, any kind of resource, jute bags. A lot of farmers were growing jute instead of rice. Even then, India had a bumper crop, but the problem was that you had Pearl Harbor in December 1941, and it became rapidly very clear that the Japanese could not be stopped. So the British panicked because the one thing they did not want to lose was India, and the Japanese were smashing through the British defenses in Southeast Asia. So by February, you already started having the implementation of a scorched earth policy. In January, you had the orders sent out from London for scorched earth, meaning that boats and food would be destroyed. Anything that the Japanese could use to invade Bengal or India. And Bengal at the time, of course, means including what is now Bangladesh, where rivers are crucial to transportation. So destroying boats meant destroying livelihoods, because farmers could not get to their fields, which were often across the river or on an island. Potters could not get their clay, fishers could not get fish. It completely smashed the economy of the region. The other thing was actual active destruction of rice. So rice was dumped in rivers. Piles of rice bags were set on fire, and this was after there had been a bumper crop. Now, sometime in April, the government seems to have realized that it was better to save the rice for consumption, and export, as it turned out. So rice started to be requisitioned, and hundreds of thousands of tons of rice were actually started being exported from Bengal and India at this time. Now, India was normally at this time a rice importer. So the Japanese invasion of Burma and Thailand, it cut off a major source of rice for the Indian poor. And on top of that, instead of making up for that deficit, India was forced to export rice. So even though Bengal had a bumper crop in 1942, by August you had the Chief Minister then, Fazlul Haq, warning that there was going to be a famine induced by these British policies. In October, you had a massive cyclone. There was a 20-foot tidal wave, destroyed Kontai. There was a flood waters in Midnapur, destroyed the local crop. And following it, and this is controversial, there was pest infestations because of this weather that was quite widespread in Bengal. So all in all, by the end of the year, the major harvest in Bengal comes in January, December. That harvest appears to have been short. And by early 1943, the Bengal governor and the Viceroy of India are both saying, look, we need food imports. Otherwise, we can't continue to supply the war effort. And India was also hosting 2 million soldiers at this time, the Indian army, plus a lot of soldiers were about to come in order to push the Japanese back. And the available resources were going all towards the army. So you have, eyewitness accounts saying that the government was going around collecting everything, fish, cattle, eggs, fruit, everything was being collected and fed to the army. And of course, food grains as well. And the situation was already dire in late 1942, and I think it's quite conceivable that the famine began at this time in places like Midnapur, where there was no relief sent initially, even though there was this devastating cyclone. The government kept the news out of the newspapers. And it was only when some ministers from Bengal went and visited that some relief started to be sent. Well, Churchill, of course, didn't really give a damn what was happening in India. He was interested in prosecuting the war. And one of the things that he did at this time that would have a crucial effect was withdrawing the shipping from the Indian Ocean area. So the shipping was moved over to the Atlantic in order to supply England with foods and other things from North and South America. Now, the withdrawal of this shipping, almost all of the shipping, meant that whatever ships were left in the Indian Ocean were carrying some things from India to the Middle East, and actually tea from Bengal all the way to England, where, supplying tea to the English was considered more of a priority than food to the Indians at this time. And what it also meant was that the economies of these regions became really constricted. That it just wasn't possible, even if there had been a will to send any relief at this point. There really was a shortage of ships. Now, there was grain in Australia. There was a surplus grain in Australia. But even after it had become clear that there was a famine in India, this is what is really shocking. Around the end of July, it was clear that there was a famine, and the Viceroy of India started asking for grain from the War Cabinet, which controlled all the shipping in the region, including Indian shipping. So there were some 80,000 tons of Indian shipping that was also being controlled by the War Cabinet. And they asked, can you release some of this shipping? And they said no. And one of the things I look at very carefully in my book was it possible to release shipping at this time? And the answer is that at this time, the British had managed to get a lot of ships from the US. So although ships were being destroyed in the Atlantic, the production of ships in the US was really massive, really. And the British had managed to get an assignment of ships for the British Empire's needs. But Churchill was not willing to release these ships to carry grain from Australia to India. They wanted to preserve both the ships and the grain for future use. They weren't even really needed for the war effort at this time. And this is crucial because a lot of the Churchill's defenders will say that at this time, it was life or death for the British Empire, and it was necessary to use these ships and the grain for the war effort. That's simply not true. The ships were used to take grain from Australia past India, probably even refueling in Bombay at the time, and on to the Middle East, where they were stored for future consumption by Europe, because it was already clear that the war was going to be won. Once the US had entered the war, it was already going to be won. That was very clear. And the ships, instead of actually feeding people who were starving and dying in India, the grain was used as part of British Empire's strategic stockpile. So the British Empire was seeing that at the end of the war, it would be in difficult economic straits because it owed money to the US, it owed a lot of money to India for the war effort. In fact, India would end up paying £1 billion of its own money for the war. That was not India's war, that was a foreign war. Total amount spent by India at this time was about £2 billion, and about roughly half of that, according to a pre-war agreement, was supposed to be returned to India from the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom was looking towards bankruptcy at the end of the war. And they were thinking, the War Cabinet was thinking that at the end of the war there's going to be a food shortage because all of Europe will have to be fed, and maybe we can make some money by stockpiling food at this time and selling it after the war. So this kind of speculation, which was being carried on by London, played a huge role in the famine in India. because the grain was actually being stockpiled. Hoarded is another word for stockpiled. You know, when it comes to Indians, they were using the word hoarders. When it came to themselves, it was a strategic stockpile. It was being hoarded for use after the war. Right. And I think the crucial factor, if you want to call it that, was the fact that India was a colony. That was crucial, because India was basically a place that had always been used by the UK to dump its economic problems. So when you look at the Depression, the way it was dealt with, in the US, the president stopped the export of gold from the US. Instead, it used it to build up a local stockpile with which he built up the local currency and the economy. In England, when it came to India, all of the money lenders who had loaned to Indian farmers, they demanded their money back. And the money lenders were actually getting their cash from the Bank of England. So the Bank of England decided to call in all the loans in India. So what happened was that from every household, if a woman had a gold bangle or a gold earring, or they had to sell it in order to meet these debts, which were suddenly called in by the empire. And Bengal was completely drained of its savings at the time. So you already have kind of a starvation situation in Bengal in the 1930s, even before the war starts, because of the billions of pounds of gold that were exported. Well, India, I forget the exact number. But it certainly helped shore up the British economy. And this was a way in which India had always been used to make Britain rich and to transfer all the economic risk. And this was the same policy used whether it's in World War I, whether it's in the Depression, and in World War II it was again the same, which was to kind of bleed India and protect England at the cost of the colonies. And India wasn't only supplying soldiers for the war effort. I mean, it has to be said that Indian divisions played a major role in beating back the Italians and Germans in Africa on behalf of the British. But those soldiers were all fed by India, because some of that money came back. But the entire effort was paid for by means of by creating inflation, by printing paper money. So you had the money supply increased by several times. And this money was all going to the arms factories, the contractors who were collecting grain, and there wasn't any money in the villages. So the money in these sort of urban industrial centers that were supplying the war effort, it ended up sucking all of the food and everything out of the rural areas. So the famine was primarily a rural famine in Bengal and also in other parts of India. For some reason, I guess because in Bengal it was most intense, that's where all the studies have been done, but there was a lot of death in places like Orissa and Trivandrum and places like that, which have never been really counted or accounted for. So the inflation, war-related inflation, was absolutely crucial to the famine, and scorched earth. In Bengal in particular, the total destruction of the rural economy by destroying boats and rice supplies.
So finally, who is really to blame for the Bengal famine?
I would say the imperial system, absolutely. The fact that India was a colony. And some of these kind of financial agreements had been set in place even before Churchill became Prime Minister. So he didn't take the entire blame, but his racism and callousness, and in particular his hostility towards Bengalis, played a major role in aggravating the famine, as well as his decisions about shipping, which the cabinet was warned at the time that it could lead to disastrous consequences in the colonies, not only in India but also some African colonies, where interestingly enough there was also a famine at the same time, which was probably also war-related, although they're usually attributed to drought. So they really didn't care what happened in India as long as Britain was taken care of. And that was kind of the crux of the matter.
So you want to mean, I mean, you mean that Churchill wanted to punish the people of Bengal to some extent?
Look, if you actually look at the documentation, that's not quite there. You do have him saying things like, it's too bad we couldn't send all the bombers over to finish off the Indians. And you do have him, he hated in particular Bengalis and Hindus. Bengalis because they had played such a big role in the independence movement, especially Subhas Bose was a real irritant at this point. There was an assassination order out against him. So he hated Bengalis and Hindus in particular, and he wanted them destroyed. But whether you can actually link the economic policies with his racism, I think you can make a tenuous link. It's not completely firm. He didn't actually say, you know, let's induce a famine so as to kill them off. You won't find that in the written record.
So could Churchill stop the famine, or at least was it possible for him, or for the British government to help Bengal administration to avoid this huge loss of life?
Well, of course. They could have, since the Viceroy had been demanding wheat, there wasn't much rice in the British Empire. And Viceroy had been demanding wheat from early 1943, saying that we simply can't keep up the war effort, that there's nothing left for the civilians after we feed the army, that you have to, I mean, he had repeatedly sent telegrams. And none of these, or these were all completely ignored by the war cabinet, just did not. And even when, that is the shocking thing, even when he said, there is a famine here, send wheat on August 4th, 1943, the war cabinet met specifically to discuss the question of sending wheat, and Amory, who was the Secretary of State for India, said we have a famine there and we need to send wheat. And the war cabinet basically refused. They said, well, okay, we can send, what is it, a tiny figure. They said, well, we'll send it to Ceylon and it can wait there to see if there's really any need. And that's really where you see the utter callousness and the complete disregard for life, as long as it was life of a subject, of a colonial subject, on part of Churchill and his war cabinet. And of course, a crucial role was played in this by Churchill's chief advisor, Lord Lindeman, or his original name was Lindeman. He became Lord Cherwell, and he was Churchill's advisor on questions of shipping and logistics. And every time the question of sending famine relief to India came up, you see the day before he sends Churchill a memo arguing against it. There's one memo he did send, I think that may have been in September, saying, well, if the situation's really that bad, maybe we should send something. But then it was Churchill who sort of decided not to. So you do have some relief shipments coming in, but the first of them start arriving in November. And in December, January, Bengal starts harvesting its own crop, which was a surprisingly good crop, given that, I mean, most of the people who had actually planted that crop were no longer alive to actually consume it.
You mean to say January 44?
I'm sorry, January 44, right. By the end of the year, that's what put an end to the famine, was Bengal's own rice crop. And that, I think, is very damning in itself.
So can we...
And I also want to say that until July, even despite all of these warnings of food shortages, India was exporting rice for the war effort. So you have this famine situation, and on top of it, and you have these British officials saying that suddenly this ship arrived in Calcutta and we were told to fill it with rice, and we had to go around looking. And when you're looking in the short market for rice, the prices immediately go up everywhere. It just aggravated the famine. There's absolutely no question. Even if you're buying a small amount of rice, it aggravates the famine in a famine situation because people realize that the situation is going to get much worse. And the moment Bengal had a big crop at the end of the famine year, the war cabinet, it stopped for a few months exporting rice from Bengal, started demanding again that Bengal export rice. So you have this absolute and unbelievable callousness towards the life of this, subject peoples. They simply did not matter. They were dispensable. I don't believe that the creation of the famine was deliberate. There were many factors that went into it. What you do see is that the famine is being created and the officials really don't care. As long as the war effort can be kept up, as long as India continues to supply soldiers and food and armaments and jute bags or whatever is necessary for India to supply for the war, it really doesn't matter if a few million Indians die in the meantime. I don't believe there was a deliberately created famine. It was probably an accidental famine, but it's compounded by the fact that the conditions were already there to create the famine. The war cabinet knew that a famine was forthcoming. When it arrived, they did not care. They took no steps to relieve it. So you have a set of conditions created for the famine. Whether it was deliberate or not, I think is debatable. I don't think the evidence is there to say that it was deliberate. Frederick Lindemann was a scientist, quite a gifted scientist, and he was of German origin, British citizen though, and he became close friends with Churchill from the 1920s. They were one of Churchill's very closest and most intimate friends, and for a long time his advisor. So at first he would advise Churchill on, say, the technicalities of warfare, on the science of warfare. When World War II came and Churchill became Prime Minister, he brought his friend in as a personal advisor. And they met virtually every day during the war. Lindemann, who became Lord Cherwell, was given an entire department of his own, a statistics division, with which he kind of often overrode the ministries, the normal ministries, oversaw their work, and it was soon clear that whenever the ministries were in conflict with the statistics division, also the S division, that Churchill would go with Lindemann's advice. Other people had absolutely no voice. So Lindemann, Lord Cherwell, was the one who had suggested the withdrawal of shipping from the Indian Ocean area in January 1943, although the Ministry of Shipping actually at the time warned that it would lead to catastrophes in the Indian Ocean area territories, which is basically, India, Africa, and so on. And he also played a key role in denying famine relief. Now, he was violently racist. Lord Lindemann, he wrote a paper at one time which was about eugenics, about how the imperial races could always stay on top by using, say, surgical methods or drugs or modern science to create a slave race that would serve without ever even imagining rebellion, like, ants serve a queen. And so this was a man who was extremely racist, who actually, would have fit perfectly well into Hitler's war cabinet if he had one. And he was Churchill's personal advisor, and he is the one who, apart from Churchill, actually he comes across as far more racist than even Churchill himself. Churchill had a soft spot for, say, the Indian soldiers who were crucial to winning a large part of the Empire's war, for the British Empire's war. But these were not things, and Churchill also had a soft spot for the British working poor, although he was also, in his youth, he had been very racist towards the British working poor. He lost some of these attitudes later in life. Churchill never did. He was so violently racist that he was physically nauseous in the presence of a black person. And this is a man who is kind of deciding, making imperial policy. It's hardly surprising what the consequences were. One more thing about Lord Churchill was that he was also behind the firebombing of German cities, so which was Britain's primary contribution to the war effort. There's kind of an interesting story behind it, which is that the Americans and the Russians had wanted a second front very early in the war. The Americans had wanted to come in and attack Germany 1941, 1942. Churchill didn't want that because he knew there would be a bloodbath. He wanted the Russians to basically finish off the Germans, and then they would come in, which is what happened. So Stalin was furious, and he sort of attacked Churchill for cowardice. And Churchill's response was, okay, look, we can do this. We can bomb German cities. And Lindemann provided the rationale for that. He said that we will destroy German morale by destroying working class homes. We will render so many people homeless. And he provided the memo that actually got the British to bomb civilians in a massive way. So the, Hamburg going up in fire, or Dresden. Churchill he was a ferocious man. He played a role in that as well.
But today, can we consider the Bengal famine as a war crime according to the Geneva Convention of 1949?
Well, the creation of conditions, deprivation of food from a captive population, yes, indeed, these are now defined as war crimes. Of course, the Geneva Conventions are not retrospective. But definitely, the creation of conditions by which a population starves, especially a captive population, and India was definitely a captive population at this time, especially in the context of the Quit India movement, which started in August 1942. You had, some 90,000 Congress supporters were arrested, 10,000 killed. You have a British general saying that India is an occupied country. In this context, for a population to be denied food. And the other important part, of course, is that not only was the British Empire unwilling to send food, it actually turned down offers of food from various sources, including Subhas Bose in the Far East. And actually, if Bose had been able to send food, it would have arrived within a matter of weeks. But they ignored his broadcasted offer of sending 100,000 tons to begin with. And Bose actually wasn't making an empty boast at that point. He had plenty of money that he had gotten from expatriate Indians. He could have easily afforded to buy and send the rice. That offer was ignored. The Americans had offered to send rice or wheat, and they had actually offered to find rice if that was necessary. That was ignored. Canada offered to send rice, and actually the Viceroy accepted, and the War Cabinet was angry that the Viceroy had accepted, but since he had already accepted, they couldn't turn it down. So some rice from Canada did arrive in India. But yeah, they were actively turning down offers of rice. There was also an effort to declare India as a place where the UN, the newly constituted UN Refugee Agency and Relief Agency could send food. And the British government conducted a campaign to make sure that India was not part of, considered war affected, and was not given food. So you have, amazingly enough, not only are they saying we're not going to do anything, but they're also saying we're not going to allow anybody else to do anything. That's what really compounds the crime. I think there is absolutely no question that the Famine Commission was a whitewash. And you have to look at the way it was set up. So when Wavell arrived as a new viceroy in, I think it was October 1943, there was a demand from local politicians, even those who were on the British side, for an inquiry into the famine. And he wrote to Amory, the Secretary of State for India, look, there's this demand, what should I do about it? And Amory said, just turn it down, make sure that there is no investigation at this point. Wavell wrote back saying, look, they're really pressing, we have to do something. And then Amory set the terms of the investigation, saying there are certain things you will not look at. You will not look at the questions of transportation or of supply, and he essentially directed the viceroy to sort of direct the Famine Commission to look at Malthusian lines. So you're going to say, oh, the population has been growing, food production has not been increasing, and that was the reason. And the viceroy also carefully chose the members of the Famine Commission. Woodhead, who was I forget what his background was, but he chose people who were counted on to be loyal to the British Empire. There was one person they made a mistake with, and he was Justice Nanavati. And he was part of the Famine Commission. And what he did a tremendous service to Indian historians, which was that the Famine Commission held a lot of hearings. These were in secret. And the transcripts of the meeting, everybody was ordered to destroy them. Except for the British, I'm sure they have some copies. Pinnell, who was a key British official in Bengal at the time, he wrote that he had kept his copies, but we don't know where they are. Probably the British government has them somewhere. Nanavati kept his copies, and they are now available in the National Archives in Delhi. And if you look at the transcripts of what they were hearing in their secret hearings, and what the Famine Commission actually published, sometimes there's really no match at all. When it comes to the number of boats destroyed, Pinnell is saying that 9 out of 10 boats that we could find, we destroyed them. And the published papers saying, oh, there was still a lot of, it provides very specific figures for how many boats were destroyed, which I think are completely false. So, yeah, I think to actually trust the Famine Commission's published report and is without looking at what it was based on, the Nanavati papers, is ridiculous. You simply can't do that. Also, the report was published the day the war ended, so as to make sure it didn't get much attention. I found victims of the famine basically through 2 different sources. There was an amazing old lady, Ashoka Gupta, who had helped start an orphanage at the time. And she was very, very knowledgeable about the famine. And she told me I should start looking at the Tamralipto Jatiyo Sarkar, the movement, the anti-British movement government at the time, the independent government that was set up at the time in Midnapur. And she introduced me to several people. Shushil Dhara was alive at the time. He wasn't really able to talk to me. Kumudini Dakua, his partner, was able to talk to me. And she was lovely. For her talking about her childhood when she was a member of the government, she was a part of the women's brigade. She was arrested, and yeah, she she actually ended up stabbing a soldier with his knife when she thought that he was going to rape her. She was arrested, and for her, recalling those times sort of made her really come alive. You could see this young girl she was at the time. She was just in her late teens at the time, and she would go around the villages and give fiery speeches. It was considered an enemy of the British government, spent at least a year under arrest, which actually spared her from suffering from the famine. Sushil Dhara had a tremendous presence. He was silent, but you could see, his kind of the dignity that he held even in him, even though he couldn't talk. It was, he had quite a impressive presence. Chitto Babu, Chitto Shamanto, he was younger than Sushil Dhara. He had been a very young teenager at the time of the famine. He was also part of the movement in a peripheral way at the time. He had seriously suffered from the famine, and what he recalled most of all was the sacrifices that his mother had made to keep him alive. He said, "I still dream of her, that she's taking care of me, that she's feeding me." And they would eat seeds of grass, seeds from the betel nut tree, boiled. Just anything that anyone could imagine would yield some calories. They would try it. And he was wonderful, and he introduced me to people in his village who had also suffered from the time. And I owe him a lot. Mm-hmm. Interestingly enough, even I did not know about the Bengal famine. Although I grew up in Bengal, my own mother witnessed it, but she never talked about it. It was a neighbor who first mentioned it to me. He had been a civil servant, an Indian man. He had been educated in England, and he had been a civil servant at the time of the famine in Kontai. And he happened to mention, and he mentioned at one point that there was a famine, that the Japanese were coming, that grain was taken away to feed soldiers. And then he refused to say anymore. Obviously, whatever it was, the experience or the memory was very disturbing to him. And that thought kind of stayed in my head. So later, when I thought I would like to explore where poverty comes from, and I decided that it would be interesting to look into this famine, which is in my own background, try to understand what happened. And maybe by sort of simplifying the problem of poverty to the single dimension of food, I may be able to understand the origins of poverty as well. When I decided to look into the famine, I went back and asked my mother, and she said, well, yes, she was a 12-year-old living in Calcutta. Her uncles worked in the railways. They brought home rice. But she, like every other middle-class person who was living in Calcutta at the time, witnessed the famine. Of course, finding an actual sufferer was something else altogether. I think the reason why Indians don't remember the famine was that it was basically a famine that did not affect the middle or upper classes. It was a famine that affected the rural poor. And the official explanation offered by the Famine Commission was that it was due to hoarding by, of course, the landowning class and speculators and so on. And that obviously it did play a role. In my book, I describe how the general economic conditions led to hoarding, so that if you had the British Empire sending wheat at some point, it could have broken the cycle of hoarding and speculation by reducing prices. That never happened. But at this time, a lot of the landowning classes were anticipating famine, and so they stocked up, partly to support their families, because it wasn't clear how long the famine would last. The Viceroy predicted it would last as long as the war would. Fortunately, that did not happen. I mean, clearly he saw it as a consequence of the war. But in any case, the upper classes did not suffer. And because of this conclusion that was made by the Famine Commission, that hoarders were to blame, I think there was a sense of guilt about what happened. And that may also have precluded really looking into what really happened in the famine. And to some extent, the guilt should be there. Of course, the upper classes, as always, protected their own and ignored what was happening to the poor, which is true to this day. But I suspect that's a major reason why the Bengal famine has kind of dropped out of the consciousness of even most Bengalis. The Bengal famine being unknown around the world is no doubt because the crimes of the Axis powers got a lot of attention. The crimes of the people who won the war, who wrote the history, were simply shoved under the rug. And that's, I think that actually still continues to be true. If you look at the reviews of my book in the Western press, some of it has been kind of very surprisingly positive. And I've sort of been surprised by the fact that my book has been well received generally in the UK as well. But some of it will go and say, well, it was the war. Churchill was fighting an evil power, and often, and that he couldn't be expected to worry about what was happening, in the peripheries. And one major reason why my book is, I think, has been sort of received poorly in the US, for example, in fact, is that Churchill is a hero. You will have pretty much every American politician at one point or the other, except for Obama, quoting Churchill at one point, saying, I want, Churchill is my hero, and, So I really feel that it's very difficult to make a dent in his image. Although I'm encouraged by parts of the debate in the United Kingdom, you will have people like Boris Johnson sort of writing paeans to Churchill, but you will also have people now sort of pointing out what a virulent racist he was, and his record not only in India but also in the Middle East and Africa. And so some of that may be changing, but it's very difficult, even now, to actually say anything against Churchill and be taken seriously by the mainstream Western press. I see imperialism as a central evil in this world, and something that has been crucial to setting up, say, the economic imbalance that you see between the North, the rich countries, and the South, the poor tropical countries. The process of colonial, basically sucking all the resources out of the colonies, along with slavery, played a crucial part in the success of the Industrial Revolution for the West. And I think it's very crucial for us to kind of understand these processes. Racism was, I believe, an outcome of these processes instead of a cause. Once you are actually actively engaged in kind of destroying a people or in using them as slaves, you kind of almost need to see them as subhuman creatures. I think it's really important to understand these things. I think it's very important, especially for the imperial powers, to face their past, whether it's the United Kingdom or France or Belgium. I do think that they have relevance in modern times. And I also think that imperialism has not entirely left the world, that there are new ways of conquering countries simply by co-opting the elites that are crucial. And I do think we can all learn from history to understand our present and to better deal with our present.